Welcome back to Falcon Central Radio on the Pro Football Central Radio Network, guys. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, joined once again after a long hiatus by my usual co-host, Scott Karasik. Today we are joined by none other than Arif Hasan. You know him from the Daily Norseman. You also know him from Zone Coverage, various other entities giving out those cold takes given his neck of the woods. Welcome back to the show, Arif.
Man, cold's right, man. We had like 20 inches of snow just like yesterday.
There you go. Well, today we are going to talk with Arif about this draft. Obviously, we'll focus on the Falcons, but we will get his insights into the Minnesota Vikings, the team that he covers daily. So, kicking off this show, we usually talk about roster moves. We got a mailbag question from Evan Birchfield. Any thoughts on the Falcons' 3 roster moves today? Scott, I can say, for once, I have zero thoughts on the Falcons roster moves that they made today. Do you have any?
Did y'all grab the Ferris State kid? Justin Zimmer?
Do you have a thought on Justin Zimmer, Arif? Because that's...
Yeah, I mean, I liked him coming out of the draft, if only because of his athletic potential. Obviously, you have to produce if you're coming from a small school. But I feel like if you're one of those small school standouts that has all the athletic potential in the world and you get cut by your first team, that like dramatically reduces your odds of being like an interesting player in the NFL. But I still think he's interesting. I don't know if it changes what the Falcons should do like in the draft or anything, but I like him. I don't know anything about the other 2 guys.
I mean, he's a kid from Ferris State who doesn't really have a lot of film to watch, and I'm just like, Like, I don't see a great football player. I just see a dude, just a guy. Then they got Garrison Smith, who's just a guy. Like, and then they got some safety who's also just a guy. So, I mean, they got basically 3 camp bodies. It's the best word to call them. Camp bodies.
It's probably fair. Okay, moving right along. Let's get into the draft. And the bulk of today's show, we want to talk a little bit about the Falcons and how they sort of evaluate players with their athletic profiles. I know Scott just recently put up some content dealing with that. We'll get into some options for the team to possibly trade up or trade down, maybe with a team like, I don't know, maybe the Minnesota Vikings. Maybe we'll get Arif's thoughts on that, as well as his thoughts on sort of how to evaluate athletic testing at each of these position groups. But Scott, since you have been out for a while now, I will concede the floor to you to take up as much time as you want discussing these athletic profiles, and I will certainly chime in when the opportunity arises.
So we've got 11 drafts worth of data right now of what Thomas Dimitroff likes to do at pretty much every position. At quarterback, he basically says athleticism, as long as you're NFL average, you're good to go. Not a problem. I don't care as long as you're not going to get killed behind the line and you're able to move a little bit, you're fine. When it comes to other spots is where it starts to get interesting. At running back, before he had Dan Quinn, he was absolutely just did not care about athleticism. And then under Dan Quinn, he drafted Brian Hill and Tevin Coleman. 2 guys that, even though Hill wasn't a pure athletic specimen, he wasn't a 4.4 guy, he wasn't a 4.35 guy, but he was still a solid athlete. For how late you drafted him, he was probably the best athlete in the draft at running back in the 5th round. And 5th round or later. So he was good there. He puts a lot more focus on athleticism under Quinn at running back. At fullback, we've got 1 fullback the entire 11 years. I'm not even counting that position. Aaron shouldn't either because it's fullback. At wide receiver, though, is what I found the most interesting. Under Dimitroff, every single receiver he drafted before the 7th round, because you can kind of throw those guys away, every single receiver he drafted before the 7th round had a 3-cone under 6.7. I think Julio's was actually the worst at like 6.71. Like it was at 6.71 or less, and then all of the shuttles were under a certain point as well. It was a 4.3 or 4.4. So I mean, he really focuses on that short area quickness, even if they don't have the 4.4 speed straight line, the way that, I don't know, Julio Jones has. At tight end, though, he drafted a lot of just wonky kind of fits, like wonky athletes. Like Levine Toilolo was goofy. Keith Zinger was goofy. I mean, the only one who's got any sort of fluidity that he's drafted, or the only times he's drafted fluid athletes were, again, under Quinn. So, and that kind of keeps going. Aaron, can I ask you a question? What was the hit rate on offensive linemen under Dimitroff when Mike Smith was here?
I can't give you an exact number, but it was poor.
I think it was like 2 for 11, 2 for 12.
That sounds about right.
The average athlete that was drafted under Mike Smith and Thomas Dimitroff was in the 20 to 22nd percentile. The average athlete, now that's taking out Jake Matthews, who's a 90th percentile guy. But I think that was more Dimitroff putting his foot down and saying, hey, we got to change something. The minute Quinn comes in, the worst athletes they've drafted, and keep in mind, these are 5th and 6th round guys, have been 50th percentile guys. You're going from atrocious athlete to average athlete. And I think if they did take a guy in a higher round, we'd see a higher level athlete. Defensive line the entire time, 80th percentile overall or higher. Doesn't matter what position, doesn't matter where it's at. In the front 7, he's always looking for that 80th percentile. Even back in 2008 when Lofton was drafted, he was in that 80th percentile. Linebackers have just gotten that much faster over the last 10 years. Every year we get another 10 guys stacked at the top of the athleticism rankings that push everybody down. But Lofton was a really good athlete for his era. Weatherspoon was the best athlete to come out in 2010 at linebacker, and he'd be 85th percentile now. So linebackers just keep getting faster. They also keep getting smaller, but they keep getting faster. So, I mean, if you see a linebacker in the mid to late rounds, guys like Shaquem Griffin, that's what you got to look for. And then cornerback, he's taken a couple guys. Again, always looks for good athletes, always looks for fast. This is another position where Rico's not under 7, not getting drafted. Even late, even guys, if they take you with Rico, it's over 7. It's because they.
Scott, your audio is cutting out a little bit.
Sorry. So the 3-cone at corner is just as important as it is a wide receiver. If you're under a 7 or even like 6.9, you're probably not getting drafted by the Falcons unless they're moving you to safety. That's the only position that they'll take you. It's higher than 7, just because they kind of see you in that fits a little better for you. You got to have a logo shut. They do put these numbers in with film and everything. You can see it. I'm not really seeing where the vertical happens. I know Charles has this theory that broad jump Falcons. I'm still not seeing there's broad jump.
Well, the interesting thing is, Scott, with the broad jump, it's really been testament since Dan Quinn came in. And that's really where the broad jump has mattered, where when you look at the 19 picks that they've had, 17 of those 19 have finished in the 50th or higher percentile for their position groups, with the 2 exceptions being Tevin Coleman and Justin Hardy. And in both cases, you could explain away why they didn't necessarily need to or value the broad jump with those 2 players, because, of course, Tevin Coleman is fast 93rd percentile in 40-yard, 92nd in short shuttle. So it wasn't really a question of Tevin Coleman lacked explosiveness that he needed to test well in the broad jump. And with Justin Hardy, given that he was projected to be a slot receiver, you're not necessarily, obviously explosive playmakers in the slot is valuable. But again, that's an instance where that three cone matters a little bit more with that change of direction and that ability to separate. And so I think with the broad jump, it really has been, looking at the Dan Quinn era, primarily it has been a broad jump, 40-yard dash sort of focused evaluation. And the three cone has become less and less important over the years, where you have a number of players, almost half the players that the Falcons have drafted over the last 3 years have been, in the lower 25th or lower percentile in terms of the three cone, where that sort of change of direction ability, it doesn't really matter to the same level that they used to value it. That's really more of a Patriot-centric sort of measure. So certainly I agree with you in terms of looking at Dimitroff drafts prior to Dan Quinn's arrival. I think the three cone was a lot more valuable in that regard. I don't think they really value it at all. You certainly look at guys like Takk McKinley and Sean Harlow and DeMonte Casey, who are all in the 15th or lower percentile in terms of three cone just from last year. And I don't think those guys would have been particularly high value targets for the Falcons in previous years prior to Dan Quinn's arrival. But so I do think the broad jump is a little bit more important to value in recent years. But it's not to say it's the end-all, be-all, because you do have some exceptions out there, like a Tevin Coleman or a Justin Hardy. But generally speaking, particularly for guys that are going to play along the trenches or guys that are going to be asked to be high-level explosive athletes, like you're looking for in terms of second-level defenders on defense, like linebacker, as well as defensive backs, and, of course, explosive wide receivers, you're going to really value that broad jump, I think, more so than maybe the change of direction ability. But I would like to bring in Arif to give his thoughts on sort of using athletic measurables, not only to evaluate players, but also sort of seeing if there are trends. And maybe he has noticed some trends maybe with the Vikings evaluations with Rick Spielman over the years in terms of what athletic traits that they tend to value.
Yeah, no, for sure. So one of the ways that I go about with the athletic testings, I try to make sure that I keep players within the same category before I test like a broad range of categories. So for example, there's small running backs and big running backs. Small running backs tend to be used a lot more in the passing game, and so they'll probably require different athletic traits. I think the same thing is true of small receivers, large receivers, and receivers that kind of fit in the middle. So for the Vikings, it's actually both Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs. They're neither small nor large. And all three of those receiver types, for example, need different sort of athletic testing in order to determine their success. I don't think the Vikings necessarily do this, but it's something I found kind of correlates with success, and different positions have different relationships with athleticism. So everyone's pretty familiar with what Justice Mosqueda does with force players on the edge, and that tends to be the best example of using athletic testing. It tends to forecast production in the long run. But this is true for every position to some extent. So for running backs, it's a little bit true. For wide receivers, it's a little more true. For cornerbacks, it's even more true. But what I find interesting is that you do really have to kind of adjust it for teams. So for the Vikings, they don't tend to care that much about the three-cone scores for offensive linemen, but they care a lot about three-cone scores for defensive linemen, especially smaller defensive tackles, as well as those players on the edge. They do care a lot about short shuttle times, which, they don't care about one, they care about the other. I find that kind of fascinating. And you can use that to kind of pinpoint what the Vikings board is going to end up being. Every year I kind of create a list of who the Vikings are probably going to target based off of their athletic testing. And I've talked to some people that have been involved with the Vikings analytics department. They've changed that over the years, and so my previous criteria don't apply anymore. But it's still pretty relevant. And over the years, I've had, if I construct a big board of essentially 70, 75 players based off of that athletic testing for the first 150 picks, they pick out of that big board like 80-85% of the time, which I think is kind of cool. If you eliminate half of the players, you can still get about 80% of the picks correct. So it's pretty clear that every team has their own kind of approach to this, and the Vikings are kind of unique in their approach. Like a lot of teams, they care about speed for corners, but unlike a lot of teams, they kind of overemphasize, say, the broad jump for corners. That's not something you typically see out of teams. But yeah, it's brought a lot of success for the Vikings. The players that they drafted have tended to do well when they've ignored that athletic testing. Sometimes you get players like Laquan Treadwell that's not working out, but sometimes you get players like Stephon Diggs, which I would argue has worked out pretty well. Generally speaking, I think that athletic testing is a really smart thing to do, but a lot of those fantasy guys, Fantasy Underground, RotoViz, etc., I think they kind of overdo it a little bit, and they start constructing overall player rankings based off of that athletic testing, and then later on they'll admit that the draft is the best predictor of who ends up scoring fantasy points or whatever, which I find just really confusing because it means that film matters a lot, and that tends to go into who gets picked where. These super athletes that have a lot of production that get picked in the 5th round don't end up producing, and they'll argue that teams are making bad decisions not drafting those players earlier, but then also conceding that those players are probably not going to do well because they were drafted lower. And so if you create a film score based just off of what you see on film, basically traits, you say this wide receiver is pretty good at getting open on inside routes, he's got a lot of shake, he tells a good story to cornerbacks in order to get open, and then you also find out that the wide receiver has tests that correlate well to that, 3-cone and short shuttle. I'm okay double counting that, but you do need to keep your film grade and your athleticism grade separate, and you can use that athleticism grade to move players up and down your board. I wouldn't move a player up or down an entire round based off of athletic testing, but I would move them up maybe almost that far, essentially, if they end up being sort of an athletic freak. Like this year, P.J. Hall is a really good example of a defensive tackle that a lot of people have heard of. Maybe he's 6th, 7th round on a lot of boards. I expect him to go into the 5th round or earlier based off of his athletic testing. He obviously also was super productive in college. And I think that's kind of an appropriate use of that athletic testing. So for a lot of teams, they'll move players up or down boards. Some teams, they're just hard cutoffs. I know, for example, the Packers have hard cutoffs at height for cornerback and stuff like that. But for some teams, it just moves them up or down the board, and it ends up looking like they only care about those players, but they just happen to value those players a lot more. So this is kind of my general philosophy on athletic testing. I think production matters, it's predictive. I think athleticism matters, it's predictive. But I think all of it really only makes sense in the context of also taking into account sort of what those film scores are.
See, for me, production isn't as important as overall film. And I think if a guy's got great overall film, you'll see production as part of that.
No, I think that makes sense. I think so. Based off of what I've looked at, especially for positions where production is very easy to measure, so wide receiver is a really good example. My look has indicated that production, when combined with draft grade, is more predictive than just draft grade, which tells me that when a player is good on film and they're productive, their production is still not being weighted heavily enough in how teams are evaluating that player. But you do have to define production in a really smart way. You can't just look at total yards or total touchdowns. Market share, for example, is something that a lot of people have talked about. People are very aware of the statistic now, but it's just the percentage of team receiving yards. For me, I've gone a little bit of an extra step, and I've taken into account teammate quality. I call this the Odell Beckham problem. Odell Beckham had a really low market share, even after you adjust for his age, because he was competing for targets with Jarvis Landry, who's obviously a really good college receiver, and has somehow finagled his way into tons of money in the NFL. He's a second-round pick. Odell Beckham's a first-round pick. If you provide some sort of market share kind of modifier based off of the expected pick value of who their teammates are, you can get even closer to providing a true production score for that player. So I have found that it does help create a better understanding of who the player is, even after you've evaluated what they do on film.
So like Calvin Ridley in 2016, when you go back and look at his film and his stats, and you're like, well, he also had O.J. Howard on that team. He also had Ardarius Stewart. He had a couple other guys there that were taking a lot of snaps, a lot of targets. That had an impact.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the general kind of rule of thumb that I found is you take a player's round. So, for example, O.J. Howard, I think he was a first round pick, right?
Oh yeah,
Yeah. And our Darius Stewart, third round pick. I've just got a really poor memory.
yeah. I think it was a third round pick. I'll double check.
Sure, but the rule of thumb is just take whatever the round is, add 2, and that's the fraction of yards you can now add to the receiver you're evaluating. So O.J. Howard, first round pick, take 1/3 of his yards and essentially add it to Calvin Ridley's yardage, and that's a pretty decent. And you do that for basically all of his teammates. So if Darius Stewart's a third round pick, take 1/6 of his yards, add it to Calvin Ridley's yards, and now you calculate the market share, and that you can now compare to someone like, let's say this year DJ Moore doesn't really have competition for his yards, right? So now you can compare it, I think, more accurately to someone like DJ Moore, and that'll give you, I think, a closer or better understanding of that player's quote unquote true market share as it relates to how it impacts their valuation.
Yes, and to be clear, for some people whose eyes might have glazed over with all this analytics and number country, I think we would all agree that these don't necessarily replace evaluation of the film, but these are things that can sort of help you, particularly when you have a glut of players, like say you're looking at a number of receivers that are sort of projected to be in the third round picks or something like that. And sort of looking at the athletic, which as just like use to basically board. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes, I think so. I think you need to build your film. You need to build your board based off of film, and exclusively film first, and then modify that based off of this other information. Because really, what this does is it gives us something objective by which to attach our subjective but good, but to attach our subjective evaluations off of, and it just kind of moves things further in the correct direction. But if you're building it based off of these numbers and analytics and whatever, I think you're going about it the wrong way.
So for me, when I've got a bunch of guys at different positions, and I've got my board built out, and I've got, I don't know, 8 guys with the same round grade or the same, top 50 grade, top 40 grade, I sort it by athletic ability so that I have more of a consistent board the whole way through, and I just use it as a tiebreaker more than anything else. So you're saying that's the way you probably should go about it?
Yeah, I think so. And I would say a little bit stronger than a tiebreaker. Like I said, I'd almost be willing to move up a player almost an entire round grade if their production scores are amazing, they're a young player, and they're super athletic. But yeah, essentially, it moves players within a tier, and in extreme circumstances moves players across a tier. So if they've got really poor numbers, I'm willing to jump them down a tier. If they've got really great numbers, I'll jump them up a tier. But that's, in relatively rare circumstances. For the most part, I would say, it allows you to rank players inside a tier.
Yeah, to use a concrete example, at least from my perspective, like for example, I think there's a bunch of one technique D tackles that the Falcons could target in the middle round range, where I would say, generally speaking, and I haven't done detailed film study to really assign firm grades on these guys, but generally watching some of these guys and think, okay, yeah, this guy's feels like a third or fourth round pick, and so this kind of does defeat the purpose of and also tested really well to the upper end of that sort of glut of players. So at that point, I would be willing to say, okay, yeah, I would feel pretty good about taking this PJ Hall in the late third round, because I feel like sort of he's in the same sort of mold as a guy like a Javon Hargrave, who the Steelers took a number of years ago, who I was also very high on. And sort of some of these other guys, like maybe a Derek Nottie, who's very productive but doesn't have quite the athleticism. Maybe he moves down. A guy like B.J. Hill, who's sort of quasi-athletic because you look at certain tests and he tested really well, and other ones he didn't test as well. So and then didn't have amazing production, but decent production. And so I might move him down, and then maybe a guy like Deidrin Sanat, who's not a great athlete but had pretty good production, particularly against the run, might move him up. Maybe say he's more of a high fourth round guy, and the other two guys are maybe late fourth round guys. And so that is an example. Not to say that that's the correct way of using it, but that's an example of how you can sort of use some of this analysis to sort of distinguish between some of these guys and put a hierarchy where guys are similar skills around the same place, and sort of using this analysis to sort of distinguish them. So really, they're all sort of players that I would draft within a round of each other, but maybe with a PJ Hall, I might pull the trigger in the late third round, while the other guys I might wait to see who's around late in the fourth round, and then if they're there, I wouldn't have any problem pulling the trigger on them. But if we're talking about pulling the trigger on them, and maybe in the third round, I might be a little hesitant, hoping that I feel like I can get a player of similar skill set in the later part of the fourth round.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to do it.
I also think you need to contextualize athleticism based on position and based on previous guys at that athleticism. So for me, a guy like Derek Nottie, when I look at his athletic numbers and I'm like, oh, well, this guy, he's not too bad. And then I see, oh, he's about a full sigma below, or he's a little bit over a full sigma below everybody else. Unless you're lucky and you get a guy like Damon Harrison, Nottie's probably closer to Joey Embu in that fringe roster guy versus Damon Harrison, who is absolutely amazing. Like, I could see Nottie falling real far in the draft just because he's not that athletic. So, to me, that's a big deal.
I think so. One of the ways, so I don't tend to do this, but one of the ways that a lot of people tend to do it is they create athletic comparables, kind of like you just did, based off of their combine scores, and that creates kind of a range of potential player outcomes based off of their combine scores. I think that's super interesting. I haven't explored it. I don't know, like, personally how effective it is, but it's very appealing and it's very intuitive, and I think that's pretty smart. And what's really great about it is that I think, like you were saying earlier, Aaron, about contextualizing these numbers within their roles, right? Like, if obviously you're not going to care about a quarterback's broad jump or anything like that, but there's some evidence to indicate that maybe you should care just a little bit about their short shuttle. I don't really care a lot about say a defensive tackle's bench press, just because there's not a lot of evidence that indicates that it matters. But I do care. If they're a smaller defensive end, I do care about their agility numbers. If they're a larger defensive end, I care about their explosion numbers. Historically, that seemed to have mattered based off of my testing. And the larger defensive tackles, they tend to be, nose tackles and run stuffers. That makes a lot of sense to me, that, their job is to anchor, or their job is to kind of get after in the run and engage in pass rush second. Whereas these smaller defensive tackles, historically, they're one gap, three technique kind of guys that tend to push up the field a little bit more. It makes sense to me that their agility numbers do matter more. And so even within positions, the roles within that position tend to matter, because the way that they're played and the way that they take advantage of their athleticism is really what you're trying to get. You're not trying to get the ideal, proto-athlete. You're trying to get the ideal player for the role that you're drafting them for. And so contextualizing those numbers makes a lot of sense within the role that they're expected to play. And I think player comparables are a really good way to get around to that, because you take into account, say, if they're a larger wide receiver, well, they don't really need to run a 4.3, and there's a bunch of large receivers that have run a 4.3 that aren't as good as a bunch of small receivers that have run a 4.3. But large receivers, they do tend to need to jump pretty well. I think, like, DeAndre Hopkins is maybe the only kind of example of a player that jumped poorly at the combine that is a prototypical large receiver. They do need to typically jump pretty well, and their role is largely to body and other cornerbacks and get open in the red zone or get open on third down. And so that kind of makes a lot of sense to me too.
Yeah, so like a good comp for what you're talking about would be like Alshon Jeffrey.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
he wasn't a 4.4 like flat burner. He was about a 4.5 guy, but 36-inch vertical.
Right.
And he's been extremely productive. And then the guy right next to him, who has the pretty much same athletic number on my index, is Emmanuel Sanders, who is a 4.4 flat guy. Just pure speed. So I see where you're coming from with that.
Yeah, I think Des Bryant's another really good example. I think he ran like a 4.54, something like that. But he had like a 36, 37-inch vertical, and like an insane 10 split, like a 1.49 10 split, just incredible for his size. And just generally speaking, those large guys, they've needed vertical much more than they've needed, that speed.
Yeah, I'm curious, sort of talking about the D tackles. Like last year, Arif, when the Vikings took a guy like Jaleel Johnson, who had really good film, didn't test particularly well. Sort of, where did you sort of contextualize some of his athletic scores along with his production and his evaluation?
Well, for me, his film was good enough to be a second-round pick, and so the fact that they got him in the third round, I think, is a really perfect way to contextualize that. The fact that he hasn't seen the field yet, despite there being a couple of opportunities, I think speaks to the fact that maybe my intuition of him as a hybrid 3/1 technique, who should be able to perform both of those roles fairly well, may not be accurate, and/or he's not going to be producing as quickly as you'd expect him to. Based off of what I saw in the film. I think that's a really good example of a guy that tested actually really poorly in a lot of categories. I think his broad jump was like okay, and the rest were just like not good. I would imagine that a guy with just his production and his film might provide some kind of counter evidence to how important athleticism is. But I'm not so sure that's the case, even if he does end up succeeding, because he did end up having to get picked around later. He did end up, than I thought he should. He did end up taking a while to make an impact with the team that had a lot of opportunities for him to get on the field, and he needs to be kind of coached up into it. Again, he's a guy I really like, so I'm kind of surprised that he hasn't done much yet, but that is a pretty good case for where athleticism maybe correctly moved him down around, at least in my eyes. Maybe the NFL always saw him as a third-round guy. I can't, speak for sure.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see sort of where he develops, because the transition from college to the pro is a substantial jump, given all the things that are thrown at rookies. Moving to a new city, trying to find a place to live, getting money thrown at you, trying to learn a new system, trying to integrate in the locker room. So it's one of those things where when a guy like that, who is as talented as he is, doesn't quite hit the ground running initially, you can hope. And this is something I've talked quite a bit about with several of the Falcons picks who didn't quite live up to expectations last year. You kind of have to give them, see where they are at the end of particularly, their second summer, their second preseason, and see if you see a substantial jump in their play on the field during those preseason games. And that gives you a little bit more confidence. Oh, okay, some of the issues that they came in with were just probably due to first year sort of jitters and making that adjustment. And it's really in that year 2 and year 3 when you really start to see the player emerge that he has the potential to be, particularly because all those other issues sort of get settled in the background.
Yeah.
Okay, guys. Well, I think we went really deep on athletic profiles and analytics. Let's talk specifically about our two teams, the Falcons picking 26. The Vikings are picking 30th. Of course, Arif, because this is a Falcon show, we will talk about the Falcons first.
Sure.
But let's
Short
talk
straw,
about
Arif.
Let's talk about the Falcons trading up in the draft. This is something that has been talked about quite a bit this offseason. It's nothing new when it comes to the Falcons. Thomas Dimitroff has been known to be very aggressive in terms of trade-ups over the course of his tenure here in Atlanta. It is something that they seemingly do all the time. And given this draft, given the D tackles at the top, those top 4 guys being Vita Vea, Maurice Hurst, Taven Bryant, and Daron Payne, in whatever order that you would like to put them in, it does seem questionable whether any of those guys will be available at pick 26. And because of the Falcons' propensity to try to trade up and make sure that they get the guy that they really want, as we saw a year ago with Takk McKinley, and even though it was a really rich edge rusher class, they probably could have waited and still gotten a good player at pick 31. They made the move to go up to get Takk McKinley because they wanted to be sure that they got the guy that they wanted. I think you could probably build a very similar case for what the Falcons may or may not plan to do this year in regards to some of the tackles, looking at sort of who goes off the board early, probably in the middle of the first round, and sort of looking at that range of picks between 17 where the Chargers are picking and 20 where the Lions are picking, where they might look to try to trade up into that range to make sure that they can probably get either the second or third D tackle off the board and they're not stuck trying to draft the fifth guy or the fourth guy that they may not be quite as high on as the other ones. Scott, what are your thoughts on that?
So when I look at the teams between, say, Arizona or Green Bay, those are the two teams that I'm kind of like, those could be defensive tackle teams. All the way down to Atlanta, I don't know if there is a team that you're thinking, oh, this team's totally going defensive tackle. Like maybe Seattle because they screwed up with Malik McDowell last year. But, I mean, I'm not seeing one where it's like absolutely needed. That being said, it's Thomas Dimitroff. They're probably trading up. Just accept it. It happens. I think there's one draft in the entire last 5 years that he didn't trade up. Or maybe two. It was 14 and 15. He didn't trade up, but the others, 13 he traded up. 17 he traded up. 16 he was trying to trade up for Keanu Neal and failed, thankfully. So I mean, he's always either trading up or trying to trade up. And I think he could go. I think they'll try it. I don't think they'll be successful with Seattle because I think Seattle's got a target that they really want at 18. I think the spot for them is 22, which is owned by Buffalo right now. But I could see it being owned by, I don't know, the Colts pretty easily. If there's a quarterback that slips and Buffalo's like, hey, we'll give you both our first-round picks for a quarterback, Colts will take it. Draft 2 offensive linemen, be happy, and then the Falcons will trade up to, say, 22. And, since it's a pretty deep guard class, you can get about the same quality guy at 22 or 26 at guard. You may not have your guy there at 26 at defensive tackle. So trade up to about 22, give up a fourth, maybe next year's fourth, and, take whoever's left over. Although I think it's going to be Taven Bryan that they trade up for. Just because when I'm watching all these guys, he's the guy that stands out to me as a Dan Quinn guy.
Arif, I'm curious sort of what are your thoughts on sort of the Falcons trading up? Obviously, I don't expect you to have the answers. We don't have the answers to what the Falcons draft board is going to look like. But sort of in terms of thinking about how you think maybe the first round could go, is this a situation where the Falcons might feel compelled to sort of move up to get the D tackle of their choice?
Yeah, well, I'll take your word that D tackle is kind of the primary player on their radar, and if that's the case, there's parts of it that I agree with Scott, parts I actually disagree with Scott. I agree that this is a very thin defensive tackle class, and if you're a team that's relatively harsh about cutoffs and you've eliminated one or two of the potential first-round defensive tackles off your board, it's obviously it's even thinner, and it makes it very difficult. But the part where I disagree is I think that there's actually a lot of instances where a team might go after a defensive tackle, and the reason I think that that's the case is take a look at what Philadelphia has done. There's a lot of general managers who are very open about taking a look at which team won the Super Bowl, seeing how they won the Super Bowl, and trying to replicate that. I think that's a pretty poor process, and I think it's kind of like small sample, short-sighted kind of stuff. But the fact that the Eagles have built along the defensive line, I think, is going to encourage other teams to continue building along the defensive line. And there's a bunch of teams where maybe it's not their primary need, but because the draft is maybe deeper at one of their primary needs, they're much more willing to go after it. So I think Seattle has a lot of needs. They need an offensive lineman, they need a cornerback, but they do need a defensive tackle. And so I could see them going after defensive tackle. I could see the Lions going after defensive tackle. Again, not the primary need, but it's a thin class. And I could see the Panthers going after defensive tackle, even though they don't need it, because that's what they do. They always go after defensive tackles. And so that's something I would be pretty careful about if I were the Falcons and I had my eyes on only one or two defensive tackles. And I don't know the Falcons nearly as well as the two of you do, but the idea that Taven Bryan is a Dimitroff defensive tackle is so perfect in my head. I think that makes a ton of sense. And I don't even like Taven Bryan all that much. But he's a super explosive athlete, and I think that kind of fits what they've been doing along the defensive line. And if they want him, they may have to trade up to get him. I am okay with the Falcons causing a defensive tackle run, even though I, as a Vikings fan, do want to grab a defensive tackle in the draft. I think, Sheldon Richardson, I think he's really only going to be there for 1 year. He signed a 1-year contract. I don't see them extending him any further than that. And they don't have a long-term answer there. But I don't think they'll get one in this draft just because of where they're sitting. And like I said, how thin that class is. And so if there is a run on defensive tackles, I'm probably happier because it means that teams are probably not going after the guard that I want. And I'd really love for the Vikings to get a guard. And so, yeah. I would be careful. The Patriots are at 23. I could absolutely see them going after a defensive tackle.
See, I thought that before they went out and traded for Danny Shelton, but just going back to Taven Bryan, Dan Quinn has this thing about drafting what I like to call Ricky Bobby pass rushers. They want to go fast, but they don't know what to do with their hands. So, Vic Beasley was a Ricky Bobby pass rusher. Pat McKinley was a Ricky Bobby pass rusher. Brady Jarrett, for his own sake, was a little bit of a Ricky Bobby guy. So, Taven Bryan, he's another Ricky Bobby guy. Get you these Ricky Bobby pass rushers, teach them how to use their hands, and have a dominant defensive line. That's what he wants to do.
Arif, I'm surprised that you don't think the Seahawks solved their D-tackle need when they signed half of the Vikings' starting defensive line, Tom Johnson and Shamar Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, I like Tom Johnson a lot. Don't get it wrong. He's 40 or something like that. He's old. His story is fantastic. It's amazing. He fought his way up through the Arena League, Indoor Football League. The Vikings took him from the Saints, which always feels good, and turned him into a really good player. But I mean, he's I think he's actually 36 or something. And Shamar Stephen is not good. So. I'm not sure the Sheldon Richardson for Shamar Stephen and Tom Johnson trade is working out in Seattle's favor.
We'll see how it plays out. Yeah, definitely. I do love that Tom Johnson is another one of those mini Saints defenders that they drafted over the years, particularly I think when Rex Ryan was a D coordinator and picked up, that went on to be really good players elsewhere, and it was part of the reason why the Saints defense has been trashed for the last 5 years. Obviously that changed last year, but it was Tom Johnson, Akeem Hicks, Patrick Robinson. There was another guy that they just kept letting go these players, and then they would go to other teams and be really good, and then the Saints would just sort of be stuck being 7-9. So I've always been a fan of Tom Johnson for that very reason, and I root for him. I rooted for him in Minnesota. I will root for him in Seattle. Obviously when they're not playing the Falcons. And hopefully I will root for him so that the Seahawks don't feel compelled to take a D-tackle, because obviously that could conflict with what the Falcons plan to do. But we'll see how that plays out.
All right.
Arif, I am curious. You talk about the guard, and I think this is a pretty deep guard class. The guard position was one that I was very focused on at the beginning of this offseason, expecting the Falcons to go either D-tackle or guard in the first round. Then they went out and signed Brandon Fusco, the great Brandon Fusco, and sort of nixed that need. I was all in on Isaiah Wynn. I feel like Isaiah Wynn is the perfect fit for what the Vikings want to do with their sort of move to that zone blocking scheme and plug him in at left guard. You also have some insights in Brandon Fusco. I guess we can pick your brain about that a little bit later. But
you might as well, right? You might as well do it now.
But I'm curious, sort of looking at some of these guards, like an Isaiah Wynn, like a Will Hernandez, like a James Daniels, some of these interior offensive linemen, which are who do you think is sort of the apple of the Vikings' eye? And is there a possibility that the Falcons decide to stay put at 26? The D tackle that they want doesn't fall to them, and they're sort of scrambling, looking around, me like, hey, let's move back. Are the Vikings a potential team that they could, call up and be like, hey, you want to move up for one of these guards, jump ahead of Jacksonville or something like that to get one of these guards and sort of move back in the draft?
Yeah, I think so. I love Isaiah Wynn. I think he's fantastic. I think I remember studying him for the Senior Bowl on my way to the Senior Bowl, reading that he was a potential third-round pick and wondering what the hell was happening, because I thought really good. Now, of course, he's being selected in mocks around pick 20, and now I'm kind of upset that the Vikings, there's a good chance that they won't be able to get him. But I think he's phenomenal, and what I saw at the Senior Bowl, I think, solidified that because he's a very natural offensive lineman. He looks like he's born to play the position. But I wouldn't be surprised if he was kind of one of the potential targets, apple of the Vikings' eyes, if you will, like you said. Obviously, that's in the case where Quentin Nelson doesn't make a dramatic fall to the bottom of the first round somehow. But yeah, I think that he's kind of perfect. Like you said, it really fits what the Vikings do schematically in order to kind of open up Dalvin Cook. They do like the zone running for Cook. It's really the best fit for him. It's the best fit for the kind of lineman that they have on the roster now. Win would be really great for that. Aside from that, it depends on how the NFL views Connor Williams. I know he's best fit as a tackle, but there's a lot of talk about him as a guard, and I think he would be excellent at either position. You could play him at tackle, move Mike Remmers to guard. You could play him at guard, keep Mike Remmers at tackle.
You could just cut Mike Remmers.
No, he's actually been all right.
I don't think the Vikings can afford to get rid of any competent offensive lineman.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely not something they can do.
Yeah,
I remember when you guys signed Remmers, I was like, just like, oh my God, please play him on the right side versus Vic Beasley.
Well, I mean, he's much better on the right side than he is on the left side. Much better. He like he was when he was on the right side for the Panthers. He's been up and down. But I would say, as someone who's been traumatized by really bad offensive line play for the past 3 years, that he's a definitive upgrade at the position over people like T.J. Clemmings, which is not the bar you should strive for, but it's kind of the measuring stick we've been given. And I would say, compared to, say, the average, right tackle, he has more really good games, and also compared to the average right tackle, he has more really bad games. But he's been fine. I kind of don't want him at guard. He's not as good at guard. And for a player like him who's so volatile, when you're not as good at a position and you're a volatile player, you're an up and down player, it can be pretty disastrous. So I would rather get a guard. But if Connor Williams is there, I think he's also a really phenomenal player. And I highly suspect that the Vikings are really in on him. My feeling about how the Vikings think about Connor Williams is very strong, that they really like him. Other than that, there's been a lot of buzz about the Vikings and James Daniels, and I can kind of see it. I think he's a really good center. I think he can only play center, and the Vikings have a really good center that they probably don't want to move to guard. So I don't really think that makes a ton of sense. And at least Pat Elflein would be a better guard than James Daniels would, but it would not be an ideal situation. So then you're left with people like, say, Will Hernandez. I think Will Hernandez is going to be great. I think that he's going to be an above-average guard for most of his career in the NFL, and really has an opportunity to make some Pro Bowls. But I think you have to put him in the right scheme, and I think the Vikings are not the right scheme for that. I think he'd be fine with the Vikings, but I don't think you get first-round value out of him by playing him in a zone blocking scheme. He would be an upgrade at the guard position, but it's not an efficient pick for them. It'd be an efficient pick for the Panthers, I think, for example. So there's a couple of other offensive tackles, offensive guards. A lot of people have been connecting them to Mike McGlinchey. I don't see it happening. No matter your feelings.
Why not?
Well, I think he'll go too early. There's not enough tackles in the class.
Okay.
I mean, there's just not enough offensive tackles in the class, and people always want to draft them. And people are pretty polarized on McGlinchey. He's one of the more polarizing players in the class. They don't talk about him because everyone wants to talk about Josh Allen, which is fair. He's the most polarizing player in the class. But I've got 40 big boards, right? And the widest range of outcomes on rankings is for Josh Allen, but the second or third widest range of outcomes is on Mike McGlinchey. Some people see him as a right tackle only, and that'll drop him down the board. And he was much better on the right side for Notre Dame than he was on the left side.
I'm sure my ranking for Josh Allen didn't help.
No, it didn't, but I don't think you were the lowest. I have a board that has him at like 179.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
I thought I was going to be pretty low on him, having him at what was it, like 89? Yeah, I have him at 89.
Yeah, and honestly, I think of him as a third-round pick too. So I get it, but no, there's some people that are putting him in like the 5th, 6th round. Which I think that's a little motivated by
I mean, I think
You know,
worst case scenario, you've got bad Jake, or worst case scenario, you've got a guy who's like Matt Schaub meets bad Jay Cutler meets like bad Matt Schaub, bad Jay Cutler, Tom Savage, Brock Osweiler, like a guy who can hold
you've got this crater in the field.
like Charlie Whitehurst holding a clipboard for 11 years and playing 9 snaps. Like, I think that is his worst case scenario. What can you do?
I like the idea that in like 5 years he's going to be a Hail Mary specialist, and they'll just bring him in for Hail Marys for a team that's got like a weak arm but pretty efficient quarterback. Like I think that would be great. Aside from him, there's a wide range of outcomes on Mike McGlinchey. But I do think I do think that he'll end up going earlier because, again, it only takes one team. There's a lot of teams that need offensive tackles.
Yeah. We got a couple of questions about the Vikings from one of our listeners, Evan Birchfield. And Arif, if you could be so kind to answer some of them. He asked, one player that you wish we could pluck off the Vikings, and for our guest, one player not named Julio Jones he wishes he could take off the Falcons.
Man, that's interesting. So, I mean, the Vikings don't have an extraordinary number of needs, and so it's like not super easy to figure that out. Probably not Brandon Fusco. I'll go there. Man, if Andy Levitra was like 5 years younger, yeah, I'd have to choose between Grady Jarrett, which would be fun, or Keanu Neal, who could just slip in right next to Harrison Smith, and that would probably be even more fun. I mean, Grady Jarrett's probably more valuable, like just the way defenses are designed. So I want to go with him, but I don't know. Keanu Neal would be tons of fun, so I'm just going to go with Keanu Neal.
So is it one on each side of the ball?
Wait, do I get one on each side of the ball?
Let's make it more fun. Do one on each side of the ball.
Jeez.
Yeah, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, sure, right. Man, I probably just get Jake Matthews. He can play on the right side, right?
Yeah, I would hope that you pick.
I would honestly keep Matthews at left tackle and move Reeve to the right side and Remmers
Reeve has been horrible on the right side. I don't know, man. Like,
move Reeve inside to left guard.
I mean, they'll figure it out. That's the point. Like, get Jake Matthews and figure it out.
Yeah, because Matthews has been a franchise caliber left tackle here.
I mean, I think right tackles and left tackles are about as valuable as each other. So, and the only reason right tackles have had less of an impact on games is just because they tend to put less talented players there. But there's a shorter range of diversity of talent. But you know, I think they're equally as valuable in the modern NFL. So I don't really care where you play Jake Matthews or Riley Reif or Mike Remmers, so long as they play well at that position, because the value proposition is not that important to me. It's just getting the 5 best linemen playing the best that they can. And so I don't think Reif plays well on the right side. I don't think Remmers plays well on the left side. And if Jake Matthews can play on the right side, I take him. And now if Jake Matthews can only play on the left side, play him on the left side. He's the best offensive lineman out of the 3 by a good margin. But yeah, just figure it out. Grab him, figure it out.
Well, if I was picking a player that I want from the Vikings, I got to go with Harrison Smith. He's the only safety that makes that could possibly eclipse my man crush for Keanu Neal in the league. Right. And so, you know, it's no offense to Ricardo Allen. I just want to have Harrison Smith and Keanu Neal playing on the same defense. Basically, I don't need to have linebackers anymore because I can just play those 2 guys at the line of scrimmage and do all the things that I ever want to do defensively, because I have 2 of the more versatile and physical safeties in the league playing on my defense. So that would be probably my pick, even though it's not necessarily a need for the Falcons. It would just be fun to have both of those guys on the same defense.
Yeah, so we're kind of of the same mind when it comes to pairing Neal with Smith. That sounds so fun.
Yeah.
Well, that would be a ton of fun, and I would love the idea of pairing Keanu Neal and Harrison Smith together. I'm going to go a little outside of the box on this one and go Xavier Rhodes. Yeah, the Falcons have two really good corners, one top 10 guy, one above, well above average guy, and Desmond Trufant and Robert Alford. But give me Rhodes and give me Trufant on the outside with Alford covering that slot and force teams to go, you know what, we're going to go into base all game. Because we don't want to see all these three corners that like to make plays on balls and, press our defenders or press our receivers every single play. And if I was going on offense, the guy I would take is Stephon Diggs.
Yeah, that would be a super great receiving core.
Diggs and Julio with Sanu in the slot and Hardy rotating in and out. I'd be more than open to seeing that every play.
So then you agree with me that Stephon Diggs is the better of the two receivers on the Vikings? Because there's like a debate.
Easily.
Okay.
Easily. Don't get me wrong. Thielen's good, but Thielen is basically the Roddy White to the Stephon Diggs being Julio Jones.
if you want to stretch, yeah, sure, let's stretch.
Yeah, let's stretch it as far as we can. They're both really good receivers, and they're both, top 20 talents right now at the position in the NFL, so you can't really go wrong.
Yeah.
I'm glad that Kirk Cousins finally has consistent receivers, consistent scheme. I just wish y'all would draft two tackles.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Thielen had a great season last year. There's no denying that. If certainly people want to say he was the better receiver last year, I think that's really can't argue it. But I think in terms of consistency, who you expect to sort of be that guy over the course of, say, 4 or 5 seasons, I think Diggs is the obvious choice. If I also, looking at the Vikings depth chart, if I had to pick another player that I would want to take off the Vikings just so he can stop wrecking the Falcons every time we play him, that would be Everson Griffin. It's interesting that, you take Jake Matthews, one of the players that he has so far in his short career shown no ability that he can block him effectively is Everson Griffin. So certainly if I could take Everson Griffin off of the Vikings team, that would maybe give the Falcons a shot at, for one time in my lifetime, beating a Mike Zimmer coach defense just once. I just want to see it happen one time.
It's Mike Zimmer's revenge. You can't do it.
Pretty much, yeah. I don't know why he's taking it out on us. Well, he should be taking it out on Louisville or something like that.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so we got another question from Evan Birchfield. Who will win a Super Bowl first, the Falcons or Vikings?
Christ. Well, man.
I'll take this one. The team with the better quarterback, the Falcons.
Yeah, I don't know, I guess. It's like, obviously Matt Ryan's a better quarterback, but the Vikings just have a much better defense. Not that the Falcons have, a poor defense or anything, but, the Vikings defense is, pretty good.
Pretty good.
I think if the Falcons get it together at defensive tackle, they could really, really improve this year.
I agree. I think that the Vikings
they were top 10 last year in both scoring and yardage. So I think we could see a situation where the Falcons are top 5 this year if they get their defensive tackle situation sorted out.
Maybe I just I don't know. The Vikings